On the morning of the 17th of April 1975, Khmer Rouge soldiers gained control of Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia. Only a few hours later, they started evacuating the city. They forced 2 million people to leave their homes and undertake agricultural work in the countryside. Most of the country's population started working in collective farms and on forced labor projects. The goal of the Khmer Rouge was to achieve an agrarian revolution and to transform Cambodia into a rural classless society comprised of collectivized farms. The country's name was changed to Democratic Cambodia in 1976, and Pol Pot, the leader of the Khmer Rouge, declared the first year of the regime as Year Zero. Over 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days, the Cambodian population lived under a regime that sought to implement rapid socialist revolution through a great leap forward by whatever means necessary, including the establishment of a strict security state, the targeting of internal and external enemies, and the forced labor of millions in rural cooperatives. Between 1.5 and 2 million Cambodians are estimated to have died from execution, starvation, and illness. But a hidden dimension of that suffering was sexual violence. An estimated 250,000 women and men were forced into marriage. The number of women and men who were raped or experienced other forms of sexual violence during the regime is unknown.
Mà pot cho sam bầm buôn này tàu qua qua ấy cặp chữ cặp ấy đấy bên này qua là hộp bài ai bong có mà khoa chẳng men ta bật lên túi ở màu đôi nhé đẹp ca ban con chạy mùi cái ở men prap men ấy cho như hào tàu lại qua đấy hào tàu chẳng cái ở dương cho hay đánh nhà tụm nè cho tụm nè ở đánh nhà thà một nít chẳng á nhóm cài còn cứ nhóm thà nhóm ở đại squal phóng bây giờ nhóm được đánh nhà nhóm mà đại squal pu nâng phóng nâng hả chẳng á thà mình là riêng con cái nấu ở nghiêm không đó nó nhóm nấu nghiêm đó nó lợn mà đòn chẳng pram cu hay là zoom là ấy ra mình là riêng con zoom á con zoom á ở zoom ấy mình con nấu riệp can phò đó mình muối chảy thứ ca ra ngày ọt khá này ra ban ọt ban mà khẽ nông quỷ để lật hồn ọt men pet men ấy men dây mọp muối nó nặng muối ra lại cô xa cho mồ là nào đó là nó bà bia là dồn châu lớn bài bị cô xa giống mà
chanh bia bọt nó bay pi bay ba bay ấy chăng không? Rạp thà pe chanh nấu ruốc pe lò pe lẩu đang nấu ruốc đang slap đang tạm rồi ná bằng đang quặn nấu nà phong cho riêng ban tan tính nó nhưng mà ban riêng nhom taro si vô cái anh men ấy bao giây này ai quạt men nàn ấy nhom taro si chăng có đã lộp đã tam kia chăng không?
After decades of silence, growing numbers of survivors in Cambodia are challenging the stigma around sexual violence. They are bravely speaking out about what happened to them during the Khmer Rouge regime. Most perpetrators will never be punished.
Đôi xa về nước mà nè cứ đi thay ruộng nơi nông cà phê khai, cana tại dương hiên này giấy dương slap hay đại dương tha kỳ vô dương tay hai cứ ở miền peตลอด màu về nhỉ tha là phiệp ở nó cứ mà nè đăng cục nè hay mà nè ban từ chơi ban sắp rạc nè tha ao dương tha đâm cờ lư ấy cả đôi của thời thường đăng thường lư ở dưới cành đôi xa nông bạch bón nước mà nước miền cà phê khai tràn hay nên nhiệt ca đại ác cọ vì muốn máu nó thôi ao ដិតជាប់ប៉ុន្តែសម្រាប់តែមនុស្សចាស់ពាក់កណ្ដាលមនុស្សអញ្ចឹងគាត់នៅរៀងភ័យខ្លាច
In 1999, Galayani Mom was one of the first researchers who uncovered sexual violence perpetrated during the Democratic Cambodia period.
My research took place in Kandal province, and this area is very close to Phnom Penh, and so is one of the first areas to be liberated, by the Khmer Rouge. My interviews were with people who had seen acts of violence, sexual violence, had witnessed rape, and knew it had happened. And so I was able to interview some people who were in prison and accused of moral offenses, even though they probably never committed it. They informed me that they observed and they had seen the prison guards, committing acts of sexual violence towards some of the detainees. And after the crimes were committed, many times, the victims were killed in order to destroy the evidence. And so many times, if a woman was being, was raped, she would never say anything. She would never, utter a word because she knew that if she did, she would be killed.
Several works of research have also suggested that sexual violence was widespread under the regime, including researches from Kazumi Nakagawa published in 2008 and Katrina Natali in 2011. Both examined crimes of sexual violence perpetrated during the Khmer Rouge period. In 2006, 27 years after the fall of the Khmer Rouge regime, the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, the ECCC, commonly known as the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, officially started its operations. During case 001, the court heard for the first time an incident of sexual violence, a rape committed by a Khmer Rouge cadre at the S21 Security Center. The former chairman of S21, Kangget Il, known as Dut, was convicted for this incident, among many other elements of his conviction and sentence. But the rape was characterized as torture. In case 002, dealing with the surviving senior Khmer Rouge leaders, Nuon Chia, Ieng Thirit, Ieng Sari, and Khieu Sampon were charged with genocide, crimes against humanity, grave breaches of the 1949 Geneva Conventions, and violations of the 1956 Cambodian Penal Code. But crimes of sexual violence were not a focus of the initial prosecution strategy or judicial investigation.
In the early 2000s, when the UN first came, sexual violence was not on its, let's say, investigative agenda. So it wasn't looking for evidence to be able to convict or prosecute a crime of sexual violence.
The crimes that are charged at any court depend on the way in which the mechanisms of the court produce those charges. So in the case of the other tribunals, it's largely up to the prosecutor in terms of what crimes are charged. And that will depend on the priorities that a prosecutor sets. It will depend on what the investigators find when they go out into the field.
When I arrived in Cambodia at the beginning of 2008, I first inquired the prosecution and others whether investigations on counts of sexual violence were conducted. And then I received the answer, no. And as an explanation, I heard that there was no evidence. And the second reason was that they had the task to investigate the death of 1.7 million people. So, and given this situation, there was a lack of evidence, a lack of time, and finally, no prioritization.
From my understanding, in the document that does exist and is publicly available, the prosecutor's initial submission to the co-investigating judges, they did request in the first initial submission for rape to be investigated. So I have no reason to believe that they ignored sexual violence at the beginning. And in the closing order of case 002, and in the trial in case 001, rape was discussed. Doik was convicted of a rape. And in case 002, the closing order talks about rapes occurring at S21, at Krang Tachan, and in cooperatives. What I know from experience in other places is it's always a vastly underreported crime for reasons that should be obvious. It's horribly humiliating to talk about what happened. It can have real consequences in many societies, in most societies. I've had, in other courts I've worked in, in other conflicts, women who did testify who told me that their husbands left them. So we know that it's a vastly underreported crime, and it's difficult to investigate.
Despite the fact that the trial chamber was seized with cases of sexual violence and that the Office of Co-Prosecutors did request for investigation on those crimes, there was a lack of focus in the prosecution and investigation of those facts at the ECCC. But thanks to parallel initiatives, survivors began to speak out.
ក្រោយពីខ្ញុំទៅប្រជុំរបស់ស្ត្រីដែលរងគ្រោះដោយសារការចាប់បង្ខំនិងរំលោភហ្នឹងគឺស្ត្រីជាច្រើនដែលគាត់ហ៊ាននិយាយហើយពេលហ្នឹងម្នាក់មុនដំបូងនឹងចាប់ផ្ដើមហ៊ាននិយាយហ្នឹងគឺគាត់បានលាក់ទុកប្រហែលជា30-40ឆ្នាំហើយពេលដែលគាត់បាននិយាយចេញប្រាប់អ្នកដទៃទៅគាត់បានប្រាប់យើងថាគាត់មានអារម្មណ៍ធូរស្រាលគាត់មានសង្ឃឹមហើយគាត់គិតថាមានអ្នកដទៃទៀតជួយយករឿងរបស់គាត់ហ្នឹងជួយលើកទឹកចិត្តឲ្យគាត់ហ្នឹងកុំបន្តការលាក់នឹងតទៅទៀតដើម្បីបង្ហាញទៅដល់សង្គមថ្មីក្មេងសម័យថ្មីហ្នឹងឲ្យគាត់ដឹងថាកាលណាយើងលាក់ទុកអ្វីដែលវាឈឺចាប់ខ្លាំងពេកហើយយើងមិនព្រមបង្ហាញចេញហ្នឹងគឺពេលដែលយើងស្លាប់ទៅយើងយកទៅតាមអត់មានន័យទេត្រូវតែនិយាយអញ្ចឹងទៅពួកស្ត្រីដែលចូលរួមជាមួយគ្នាហ្នឹងគឺថាយើងម្នាក់ហ៊ាននិយាយ
In 2011, a women's hearing was organized by a local non-governmental organization, the NGO Cambodian Defenders Project. For many survivors, it was the first opportunity to speak out about the crimes of sexual violence that they had experienced under democratic Cambodia.
នេះជាច្បាប់ដែលខ្ញុំអាចហ៊ាននិយាយខ្ញុំសង្ឃឹមថាច្បាប់នឹងគ្រប់គ្រងខ្ញុំច្បាប់នឹងរកយុត្តិធម៌ឲ្យខ្ញុំច្បាប់នឹងជួយលើកទឹកចិត្តអ្នកជនរងគ្រោះក្រៅពីច្បាប់ខ្ញុំអត់និយាយក្នុងច្បាប់ក៏ខ្ញុំនិយាយតែអ្នកណាមួយដែលខ្ញុំទុកចិត្តដែលខ្ញុំហ៊ាននិយាយការពិតដល់ខ្ញុំហើយខ្ញុំសូមនិយាយសូមដាំផ្ញើទៅអង្គការពិភពលោកថារឿងនេះជារឿងពិតសូមលោកមេត្តាទទួលស្គាល់និងជួយជនរងគ្រោះដូចជារូបខ្ញុំរស់នៅតាំងពីគេបកាចិញ្ចឹមចៅរស់យ៉ាងវេទនាបំផុតក្រុមអ្នកច្បាប់ចុះផ្ដល់ផ្ទះនាងខ្ញុំជួយលើកទឹកចិត្តជួយផ្ដល់ទឹកចិត្តរហូតដល់អ្នកខ្ញុំអស់ចិត្តហ៊ានលាតត្រដាងការពិតបើខ្ញុំលាក់ការពិតអង្គការក្រៅរាជរដ្ឋាភិបាលគាត់មិនបានដឹងឬក្មេងខាងក្រោយក៏គាត់មិនបានដឹងការពិតនៅក្នុងរបបនោះវាសាហាវប៉ុណ្ណា
But it was during this hearing that the victims understood that the man who committed acts of sexual violence against them would not be prosecuted at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal.
At the ECCC, we have only senior leaders and most responsible who can be prosecuted. So that means the perpetrators on the ground, who testified here, identified, these perpetrators, immediate perpetrators, cannot be prosecuted in this court.
I had to deliver this message, yes, and the victims and civil parties there were different reactions, I must say. So some were very disappointed, some couldn't understand why, when they just had learned that this is a crime, and a serious crime, and a grave crime, and that they just were able and just learned to speak about it and to recall it and to get back into this situation, and that these crimes, however, did not find the interest or the attention of the co-investigating judges and the prosecutors, of course, because they seized the co-investigating judges, and that means they should have first investigated these cases.
The Transcultural Psychosocial Organization, known as TPO, is Cambodia's leading NGO in the field of mental health care and psychosocial support. In 2014, the NGO conducted a survey on 106 civil parties and issued a report entitled Like Ghost Changes Body. The survey found that 97% of interviewees were forced to marry. According to the testimonies included in the survey and report, the mass ceremonies could involve anywhere from 3 to more than 100 couples at a time. In August 2016, the ECCC finally began hearing evidence in a specific trial segment on the regulation of marriage, including charges of forced marriage and rape within the context of marriage during the period of democratic Cambodia. This segment fell within the larger trial of case 00202.
ដំបូងឡើយគឺជនរងគ្រោះក៏ដូចជាពលរដ្ឋខ្មែរអត់ទៅយល់ចិត្តស៊ីជម្រៅទេអំពីអង្គហេតុការរៀបអាពាហ៍ពិពាហ៍ដោយបង្ខំដោយសារតែមួយផ្នែកវិជាប្រពៃណីខ្មែរខ្លះពីមុនមកដែលថាជួនកាលគាត់ត្រូវបានឪពុកម្ដាយរបស់គាត់ធ្លាប់គូកងឲ្យរៀបការគាត់អត់ដែលឃើញមុខគ្នាមុនផងប៉ុន្តែនៅពេលដល់សម័យខ្មែរក្រហមមានអង្គហេតុនៃការរៀបអាពាហ៍ពិពាហ៍ដោយបង្ខំយើងមើលរូបភាពប្រហែលគ្នាហើយពលរដ្ឋខ្មែរក៏អត់ទៅចាប់អារម្មណ៍ប្រមាណទេថាជាអង្គហេតុនេះគឺជាឧក្រិដ្ឋកម្មសំខាន់គួរតែដាក់បន្ទុកទៅដល់ជនជាប់ចោទប៉ុន្តែដល់ពេលដំណើរការមករយៈពេលមកនៅក្នុងដំណាក់កាលស៊ើបអង្កេតជាពិសេសក្នុងចន្លោះឆ្នាំ2009 2010ពលរដ្ឋខ្មែរកាន់តែច្រើនឡើងបានចាប់ផ្ដើមយល់ថាការរៀបអាពាហ៍ពិពាហ៍ដោយបង្ខំការបង្ខំរៀបអាពាហ៍ពិពាហ៍ខុសពីឆន្ទៈរបស់គាត់ដែលកើតឡើងនៅទូទាំងប្រទេសកម្ពុជានេះគឺជាការប្រព្រឹត្តអំពើអមនុស្សធម៌ផ្សេងទៀតដែលជាផ្នែកមួយនៃឧក្រិដ្ឋកម្មប្រឆាំងមនុស្សជាតិ
Forced marriage has emerged as one of the different forms that sexual violence takes because it is a violation of the autonomy of individuals by forcing them into a marital and sexual relationship against their will.
This trial segment in case 00202 has enabled greater understanding of how marriages were allegedly organized under the regime. The Khmer Rouge leadership, referred to as Angka, took over the role of parents, forcing individuals into marriages largely without choice or consent.
And it wasn't really about uniting, two people together and bringing two people together as a husband and wife as much as showing them who is the boss. Angka is the boss. Angka is the premier. And you must do whatever it takes to provide and serve Angka. And so the marriages came about, very quickly. Somebody would be working in the fields, transplanting rice seedlings, and then, somebody comes and says, oh, hey, when you're done with this, come with me, you're going to get married. I mean, it literally happened like that. And people would come, and sometimes it would be 100 couples, standing together. It was just a way to control you again.
បើកឡានមកដឹកអាវសពុតហើយកម្មាមានថ្នាំដុសធ្មេញមកដបសាប៊ូក្អូបមកដុំហើយនឹងសាប៊ូម្សៅនោះមកថងយកមកដើរចែកឲ្យតែប៉ុណ្ណឹងហើយគោថ្ងៃអាសៀលបន្តិចហ្នឹងគោបានហៅទៅកន្លែងគេធ្វើជាសាលាមួយសម្រាប់ប្រជុំអប់រំលេងកម្មករហ្នឹងគោទៅរៀបនៅកន្លែងហ្នឹងទៅដល់គោគេហៅចូលទៅអង្គុយទៅរៀបជួរគ្នាប្រុសដោយប្រុសទៅស្រីដោយស្រីទៅហើយគេឲ្យយើងងើបគោរពទង់បាក់បានគេហៅម្នាក់មកគូទៅចាប់ដៃគ្នារួចទៅបានគេឲ្យមកអង្គុយជាប្តីប្រពន្ធមកគូរៀងខ្លួនមកដល់ពេលនេះទៅក៏គាត់អប់រំពីរឿងយើងរស់នៅមានជាគូស្វាមីនឹងទៅឲ្យយើងនឹងចេះសាមគ្គីគ្នាចេះស្រឡាញ់គ្នាខំប្រឹងធ្វើការងារជូនបាក់ជូនប្រជាជនអី Trong vị thi điệp ca nơi chúng non mai có hôm nó cứ chập châu tập ông chân tới cái hai đặt tam cù rằng của bộ trong nhưng trong tầng óc cái rất oswald đi đằng mùi na thì toàn cái hai chúa cái đặc đại đã hai chúa đặc đại đã tới bạn đằng cù na đào pe châu đã đòn chân tới cô ông ca cái đại đam rồi tha ở group ông ca vì đây anh tinh tôi chân tới cô cái ai mấy luôn nó đại nhà chặt cái anh đại nhà chặt nó miền ấy thế miền ta cái điều thì nó có rong cua sờ.
All the civil parties who testified on the topic of forced marriage were, I think, very, very touched also by their testimonies and by the ability that was given to them to express their stories in court. We've heard very different stories from one region to another. Marriages were different in 75, in 77, in 78. So I think the trial also managed to highlight all the nuances.
A former cadre of the Communist Party of Cambodia testified about how he was following orders to organize marriages.
Hãy gọi chân chặt mày chặt ấy nè có đầy lai hai ca sầm rạch ơi đừng o em còn là thêm cú công tam hai ca bằng phật cái nạ sọc tê.
And they monitored if you were, unhappy or happy with your husband. They had spies, little kids who would come, underneath the house, listening to you to see if you were unhappy, to see if you were actually being a couple. Because even though they didn't want people to commit moral offenses, they did want people to reproduce and have children for Angka, but only reproduce in a way that they wanted it to.
Cái này cái mau thôi ca nơi chung ông gặp hết năng phong hỏi đào pe dục láng cái mình oi nè cà pi năng cà pi chụp nè trong phong hỏi mà mưa thay room tầm này bảo sao này mình room tầm này tới cái ảnh mình thư bị thiệt là cà sang tiền.
Dạ xong nè say ấy riệp rọp chun ông sao na ca riệp mới thằng chụp đầm bông này ngay đặt nhà chặt hai nó tá miên ở vây cát láng chấm po nè say. Về kiếm tới sầm rạ nấp xa tu tập pung nó cứ miên bông nè bẹt kiếm tham mà em giặt luôn á. Cái bông tam đa này, đó về kiếm tới sầm rạ nơi tia mùi nắng cứ bay nè, tia nắng miếng cái tục trơn, tới bay nè nắng bay cu nắng về bay cái tục nắng, đó về giúp chăm đạp mơ cái lư sầm rập trường đa tới trập trường tới, đó về tới lăng chỉ ta chẳng lư chỉ taประมาณ cam chăm hộp mơ cùi hộp mơ hộp cam từng cứ chụp tới tam đan buộc nhom, hỏi tới chẳng chia từng cùi đạp mơ tới nơi tới đó lăng tới ngặt mà thu thông chứ bạn phụ nó trong một bình phụ cho mà hiền mọt đây nó sẽ ngon mà hiền mọt thì
không mà pe dục nó cái ao dân đi nơi lại nó ọt oi miền tây na đi cái ao dân đi thấy dân ọt đằng luôn thả chlop cái tam đàn dân chẳng mấy cứ ọt đằng thì còn tay cô phía kia ở đây buồn cái trong từng pi nè này bàn về kia thả dân ca center bà sọc sụt 400 dân xong bay kia về chẳng tới ọt đằng thả chlop cái nơi cầu tia thế đòi chlop cái lư xô thanh trắng cái làng plate màu sro màu bay nè mà đòi rồi máu cái vô phơi mà chuồng đo ai khang pro có đo ai khang khắc sấy có đo ai đang bay rùm từ đây chỉ mùi kia việc chul pel đó là cả na việc phần non việc ban phơi rồi phần đại thái việc gì thằng tới dân tới ta mà khang nó tiệt ní khi nhom xôm pรับphiệp mà ní khi nhom chămชีวิตkhi nhom chong chăm choแต่khi nhomสลับก็khi nhomอดผลิตได้
កម្ពុជាទៀតតៃគាត់មានគោលនយោបាយសំខាន់5ហើយក្នុងចំណោម5នោះគឺមានគោលនយោបាយមួយស្ដីអំពីការពង្រីកចំនួនមនុស្សនៃរបបកម្ពុជាជាធិបតេយ្យនៅឆ្នាំ1977ប៉ុលពតគាត់បានប្រកាសថាកម្ពុជាជាធិបតេយ្យនឹងធ្វើម៉េចបង្កើនចំនួនមនុស្សឲ្យឡើងទៅដល់20លាននាក់ដែលក្នុងពេលនោះគឺមានចំនួនតិចលានចំនួនពលរដ្ឋហើយក្នុងរយៈពេល10ទៅ15ឆ្នាំធ្វើម៉េចបាន20លាននាក់ គោលនយោបាយនេះត្រូវបានអនុវត្តនៅទូទាំងប្រទេសកម្ពុជាគឺតាមរយៈការបង្ខំមនុស្សឲ្យរៀបការដោយមិនមានការត្រៀមទុកមុនពីសម័យខ្លួននេះគឺជាគោលបំណងរបស់បកចង់ឲ្យមនុស្សរៀបអាពាហ៍ពិពាហ៍ហើយចង់ឲ្យមនុស្សមានកូនហើយកូននេះស្ថិតនៅក្រោមកម្មសិទ្ធិរបស់អង្គការតែម្ដងដូច្នេះផែនការរបស់បកកុម្មុយនីសកម្ពុជានេះគឺយកវាសនាជោគវាសនារបស់ប្រជាពលរដ្ឋហ្នឹងស្ថិតនៅក្រោមចំណាត់ការផ្ទាល់របស់គាត់ដោយមិនចាំបាច់មានការព្រមព្រៀងពីសម័យខ្លួនបាទគាត់ថារៀបការទៅដើម្បីបង្កើតកូនកើតចៅឲ្យបានកូនចៅច្រើនទៅដើម្បីជាកម្លាំងការពារប្រទេសជាតិ
In a radio extract from 1977, the leader of the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot, announced one of the objectives of the regime. The verdict in case 00202 is expected by the end of 2017.
The real question for the court is to determine, was there a policy? In order for there to be a policy, you don't have to find a piece of paper that says there's a policy. What you essentially have to have is a pattern of activity that shows that there's organization, that it's systematic, that the same kinds of things are occurring in different places in similar ways. And from that, we infer that this is state-organized activity pursuant to a government policy.
Before the court reaches a verdict, however, some benefits of case 00202 for victims, survivors, and younger generations have already been recognized.
The trial created and provided a forum for men and women who lived during the Khmer Rouge to talk about marriage and to talk about sexual violence. We've been on trial for 2 years now, so we've heard a lot of evidence, and it was quite striking to hear the amount and the breadth of evidence in relation to marriage and also in relation to sexual crimes.
It's also very, very important, what I've seen throughout the world in the courts I've worked in Bosnia and Sierra Leone and Darfur, victims want to see a recognition of the suffering that happened to them. I believe it gives some small measure of satisfaction to victims that the society, the courts have recognized what happened to them, that it was wrong.
What is happening in Cambodia today with the ECCC, we should all be so grateful to these civil parties who are sharing their stories because they're helping us to create new law that can protect fundamental rights for the future generations. To me, that's extremely exciting when it comes to the ECCC.
The participation of civil parties is also about transmission and how you want to tell your story and how you want to tell your story for the younger generation to know. And I think this element is key in the participation of civil parties.
Another benefit of the ECCC is that if the trial chamber renders a guilty verdict, civil parties can seek moral and collective reparations. The court encourages projects that address the harm suffered by civil parties.
Some nong noក្នុងបរិបទរបស់សាលាក្តីខ្មែរក្រហមគឺជាប្រភេទជាសំណងជានិមិត្តរូបដែលជាទូទៅគេអត់គិតជាហិរញ្ញវត្ថុឯងជាលុយជាកាក់ឯងប៉ុន្តែជាការទូទាត់ជាការជួយសម្រួលទៅដល់អារម្មណ៍ផ្លូវចិត្តរបស់ជនរងគ្រោះ
And we put a lot of emphasis on artistic projects in general in the context of reparation projects because we think it's a very good way to go beyond the limited public for reparation projects and tried really to reach out to a broader audience and to the younger generation.
One of these moral and collective reparations projects is named Kasla Kraum Angka. This classical dance drama is narrated using the story of a couple that was forced to marry during the Khmer Rouge. But this couple has remained together until today. Kasla aims to encourage a dialogue between communities and generations. Sophie Lintiem Shapiro is the artistic director of Kasla Dance Performance.
ចំពោះនាងខ្ញុំជាអ្នកបង្កើតក៏ដូចជាសិល្បករយើងទាំងអស់ទាំងតន្ត្រីករនិងអ្នករបាំផងដែរយើងមានប្រាថ្នាថាការដែលយើងសម្ដែងជូននៅស្នាដៃនេះសង្ឃឹមថាទស្សនិកជនទាំងអស់បានទទួលយល់ដឹងអំពីការឈឺចាប់បងឬឪពុកម្ដាយយើងដែលគាត់បានឆ្លងកាត់នៅក្នុងការបង្ខំឲ្យរៀបការនៅក្នុងសម័យប៉ុលពតនេះឲ្យយើងបានដឹងយល់អំពីរឿងរ៉ាវរបស់គាត់អំពីការឈឺចាប់របស់គាត់ចាហើយសង្ឃឹមថាការឈឺចាប់នេះជាមេរៀនរបស់យើងសម្រាប់ពេលបច្ចុប្បន្ននិងទៅអនាគត
Other initiatives take advantage of the debate created by the ECCC to encourage further dialogue about forced marriage during the Khmer Rouge period, especially with the younger generation. The Tuslang Genocide Museum, S21, houses a special exhibition featuring an extensive collection of oral histories compiled by the Cambodian Women's Oral History Project and the staff of the museum. The exhibition gives voice to the many survivors of the alleged policy of forced marriage.
ចំពោះការរៀបចំតាំងពិព័រណ៍ស្ដីពីប្រធានបទទាក់ទងនឹងការរៀបការដោយបង្ខំនេះគឺជាពិព័រណ៍មួយដែលរៀបចំដោយមានការព្រួយផ្ដាំគំនិតពីក្រសួងវប្បធម៌និងសិល្បៈជាពិសេសគឺខាងគណៈកម្មការនារីរបស់ក្រសួងយើងដែលបានសហការជាមួយនឹងទួលស្លែងដើម្បីរៀបចំពិព័រណ៍នឹងមួយនៅទីនេះមែនតើទៅយើងមានគម្រោង5ឆ្នាំទាក់ទងនឹងការរៀបចំពិព័រណ៍ប៉ុន្តែនេះជាពិព័រណ៍ដំណាក់កាលទី1ដែលយើងជ្រើសរើសទាក់ទងជាមួយនឹងការរៀបការដោយបង្ខំនេះដោយសារយើងចង់យកប្រធានបទនឹងរំលេចទាក់ទងជាមួយនឹងផលវិបាកបង្ហាញមែនតើទៅបង្ហាញពីផលវិបាករបស់ស្ត្រីដែលបានឆ្លងកាត់ក្នុងសម័យ3ឆ្នាំ8ខែ20ថ្ងៃហ្នឹងគឺរបបអាវខ្មៅហ្នឹងចែកជូនដល់សាធារណជនឲ្យបានយល់ដឹងពីរឿងហ្នឹង
In case 00202, the trial chamber has determined that the accused have only been charged with crimes against humanity for rape that occurred within the context of forced marriage. This means that crimes of sexual violence that occurred outside the context of forced marriage, such as in security centers or work sites, will not be prosecuted in this trial.
In the closing order of the co-investigating judges for that case, what they explain is that they found that rapes did occur in places like S21, Krangtachan security centers, cooperatives. But for criminal charges against someone, it's not sufficient to only show that the crime occurred. Of course, you have to show that the individual accused is responsible, criminally responsible, for those crimes. So the fact that an army has committed a rape in a conflict, or soldiers of an army, would not necessarily mean you have evidence against the vice president of that country for their crime, or even the president of the country. There needs to be a linkage. In the closing order, what the co-investigating judges found is that it was not a policy of the Khmer Rouge for rape to occur, that they had a prohibition on moral offenses. So they said that there was not a linkage. So given that, the charges that went forward to trial that we are bound by are that do not show a criminal responsibility for the top accused, according to that closing order, for the rapes that did occur.
This limitation has been criticized by experts.
The rapes were not just inside the forced marriages, they were also outside of forced marriages. There's an investigation now for 004. That took a lot of advocacy, that took a lot of pushing. And so we have the documented evidence. It did happen. It happened in context of torture. It happened in context of arbitrary detention and arbitrary execution. It happened as punishment. It happened as sexual slavery. All of the ways that you would typically see sexual violence during a conflict scenario are the same here. Cambodia was not an exception.
Even if other crimes of sexual violence have not been charged, evidence has been heard at the ECCC through the testimonies of the civil parties who recounted experiencing and witnessing a variety of sexual violence, including torture and rape by multiple soldiers at one time.
There's somehow a standard view that sexual crimes did not occur during the decade because sexual intercourse outside of wedlock was basically reprimanded and constituted a moral offense. But listening to all the testimonies we listened to, including the ones in relation to security centers, we realized that rapes did occur during the decade.
Cái đăng rương mật trong pi nè năng miên nè cả mà ba nó không năng cứ chắp rùm lốp khục kia thằng nấu piên này là không lệ bồ bầm piên nấu mật phạt trong pi nè năng năng slop hùng nhau mà cái giờ sẽ bớt ai thì miên ca hệ cái nghĩa xa không khu nó gì mà hay máu qua từ bánh quạt ba này dây lên cho người nhom thà ôi ắt bạn đi ta miên khó rồi vô đã tiền này năng á bộ còn nạ không bộ nạ thông nó không năng cứ cái rùm lộp hơi cho ca sạch
bất cả cõi mọc tiết miên cả này muối đại cứu ao chi chập bằng phật krom của sa muối từ ban lốp chập rùm lốp stray mà nè đại chỉ con krom của sa năng cõi bị chập rùm lốp hai từ ban sầm lập tamระยะการดังระบบขยมcứ sầm lên sải, cõi máu của nhom đằng thà, nẹt nó tự bàn sập tam dạng ca sầm lậpរបស់ខ្មែរក្រហមព្រឹត្តិការណ៍ទាំងអស់នេះជាព្រឹត្តិការណ៍មួយដែលចុកចាប់បំផុតនៅក្នុងជីវិតរបស់ខ្ញុំក្នុងឋានៈជាកុមារក្នុងវ័យអាយុប្រហែលជា12ឆ្នាំ
The cadres, the Khmer Rouge cadres, the people who were in power at that time, they had so much power. They could do whatever they wanted to do. And with that power, came almost like an obsession, an obsession to express that power in any way possible, and that meant, to hurt, abuse, especially, women.
បើអ្នកដែលឃើញអ្នកចាប់លោបហ្នឹងគឺប៉ាខ្ញុំផ្ទាល់ហ្នឹងបានគាត់មកសាប់ប្រាប់ខ្ញុំគេឲ្យប៉ាខ្ញុំគាត់ធ្វើអាជីអាចហ្នឹងហើយជីលេខ1ហ្នឹងគាត់យកគាត់ទៅឃើញបានគាត់ភ័យព្រោះឃើញសភាពអស់ហ្នឹងគាត់ខ្លាចកូនគាត់ដូចគេចឹងដែរខ្លាចវាសនាពួកខ្ញុំដូចពួកបងស្រី2នាក់ហ្នឹងកងស្លាត់2នាក់អាហ្នឹងវានឹងបានឃើញជាក់ស្ដែងវាលុបទម្លាប់ហើយយកក្របបានមកចិនញុកក្នុងកេរខ្មាស់របស់ស្ត្រីនឹង2នាក់អាហ្នឹងវាទម្លាប់ហើយវាសម្រាប់ចោលវាបានឲ្យខ្ញុំទៅលុបទៅកប់ខ្មោចនឹងពិតប្រាកដ
We now understand that sexual violence is not something that happens on the periphery of a conflict, but is part of the nature, armed conflict, genocide, and so forth, because it's a way of controlling, dominating, destroying, dehumanizing a targeted population.
Not on a link away by the conclusion that got đau cho mùi trong cửa xa mình ai chia tầm khăn đi cứ nhom đi nhơiแต่ถึงไอ้นี่ยังซ้อมจะปรับเธอยังจะไอ้หนึ่งเราบอกไปที่ทำไปการไปถึงไอ้นั่น
I don't think that trauma will ever leave us until we are able to face the truth of what happened and also able to express emotionally, verbally, orally, the experience that we went through.
In order to address this trauma and to contribute to sustainable peace efforts, the local organization Kadai Karuna has implemented innovative programs that provide a forum for families to discuss the impact of forced marriage.
ដែលគម្រោងកិច្ចសន្ទនាគ្រួសារនេះគឺយើងលើកកម្ពស់ឲ្យមានការជជែកគ្នាការសន្ទនារវាងសមាជិកគ្រួសារនិងយុវជនជំនាន់ក្រោយមានន័យថាកូនសម្ភារឪពុកឬម្ដាយឬជីដូនជីតាដែលធ្លាប់ឆ្លងកាត់សម័យខ្មែរក្រហមឱកាសនេះដែរថ្ងៃនេះដែរក្រុមគ្រួសាររបស់និស្សិតទាំង10នាក់ហ្នឹងក៏ចូលរួមជាមួយយើងដែរគាត់ចូលរួមជាមួយយើងគាត់មានឱកាសមកចែករំលែកបទពិសោធន៍ផ្ទាល់ជួបសន្ទនាជាមួយយុវជនដទៃទៀតពីបទពិសោធន៍ដែលកូនគាត់ទៅសម្ភាសគាត់ដល់ផ្ទះមានន័យថាស្នាដៃដែលយើងសម្ភាសជាមួយនឹងរឿងរ៉ាវផងគាត់ហើយយើងយកអាព័ត៌មានទាំងអស់ហ្នឹងទៅចែករំលែកទៅដល់មិត្តភ័ក្តិឬក៏សហគមន៍ផ្សេងៗឲ្យគាត់បានដឹងពីរឿងរ៉ាវទាំងអស់ហ្នឹងដើម្បីយើងទាំងអស់គ្នាចូលរួមផ្សះផ្សាផ្លូវចិត្តផន់ជនរងគ្រោះក៏ដូចជាផ្សះផ្សាទៅដល់សហគមន៍ឲ្យយល់ពីព័ត៌មានទាំងអស់ហ្នឹងព្រោះអីកាលណាដែលយើងមិនបានសម្ភាសឬក៏បានចងក្រងនៅឯកសារទាំងអស់ហ្នឹងទេសួរថា20ឆ្នាំឬក៏30ឆ្នាំទៅមុខទៀតឯកសារជាផុសតាងឯកសាររស់គេហៅឯកសាររស់ហ្នឹងនឹងអាចផុតរលត់ទៅតាមរយៈការចែករំលែកហ្នឹងកិច្ចសន្ទនាគ្រួសារដែលខ្ញុំធ្វើឡើងហ្នឹងបានន័យថាខ្ញុំធ្វើជាមួយគ្រួសារពុកម្ដាយបងប្អូនខ្ញុំតាក់ទងទៅលើរបបខ្មែរក្រហមដែលខ្ញុំវឹកខុសទៅលើឪពុកម្ដាយខ្ញុំដែលខ្មែរក្រហមបង្ខំឲ្យរៀបការអញ្ចឹងអ្វីដែលខ្ញុំសប្បាយចិត្តនៅពេលដែលខ្ញុំសន្ទនាជាមួយគាត់គឺបានន័យថាពីមុនមកយើងមិនអាចសម័យឃើញថាគាត់បានចែកម្លែកបានកម្រិតហ្នឹងពេលហ្នឹងគឺទុកកង្វល់ឬក៏អ្វីដែលមាននៅក្នុងចិត្តគាត់ទម្លាយអាចកំបាំងមកឲ្យយើងដឹងពីបញ្ហាការរស់នៅមិនចុះសម្រុងពីបញ្ហាអ្វីផ្សេងតែជាអតិពលផ្សេងក្នុងផ្នត់គំនិតអារម្មណ៍គាត់ហើយក៏គួរភាពជ្រះស្រឡះនៅពេលដែលគាត់ចែកម្លែកមកឲ្យយើងហ្នឹងខ្ញុំយល់ថាវាពិតជាពាក់ព័ន្ធគ្នាវាពិតជាចាំបាច់ក្នុងការដែលទៅចែកគ្នាពីរឿងអំពើហិង្សាផ្លូវភេទដែលបានកើតឡើងក្នុងសម័យខ្មែរក្រហមយើងដឹងថាក្នុងសម័យខ្មែរក្រហមមានការរំលោភបំពានផ្លូវភេទមានការប្រព្រឹត្តផ្សេងគ្នាមានការរើសអើងផ្លូវភេទចំពោះស្ត្រីនិងបុរសក្នុងសម័យខ្មែរក្រហមដែលបញ្ហានេះមិនសូវដឹងជាទូលំទូលាយទេពីព្រោះតែមូលហេតុបើជនរងគ្រោះពីការរំលោភច្រើនទៅត្រូវបានសម្លាប់ឬក៏ត្រូវបានស្លាប់នៅក្នុងសម័យខ្មែរក្រហមពេលដែលរបួសផ្លូវចិត្តរបស់អ្នកណាម្នាក់ឬក៏សង្គមមួយមិនត្រូវបានយកមកដោះស្រាយជាពិសេសរបួសពីអតីតកាលមិនត្រូវបានយកមកដោះស្រាយរបួសនោះគឺនៅតែដិតដាមជាប់នៅក្នុងចិត្តនៅក្នុងអារម្មណ៍ដែលទោះបីជាពេលវេលាកម្រិតណាក៏នៅតែមិនអាចព្យាបាលរបួសនេះដែរមានតែយកវាមកទៅជែកមកពិភាក្សាយកមកដោះស្រាយទើបរបួសនោះអាចជាសះស្បើយហើយបន្តដំណើរទៅមុខទៀតមានន័យថាប៉ុន្តែនេះមិនមែនមានថាយើងបំភ្លេចទេយកវាមកទៅជែកដើម្បីទទួលយកអតីតកាលហើយដើម្បីអនាគតរបស់យើងទៅមុខទៀត
In 2013, UN Women conducted a report called "Why Do Some Men Use Violence Against Women and How Can We Prevent It?" This study was conducted in 6 countries in Asia and the Pacific. In Cambodia, nearly 2,000 men were interviewed.
What it showed is really a very high rate of perpetration of sexual violence. The study was carried out in a number of countries in Asia, and Cambodia was notable for the level of sexual violence. Key findings included that 1 man in 5 said that he'd raped a woman in his lifetime, and 1 man in 20 had taken part in a gang rape, which is very shocking and disturbing data. One of the very interesting findings was that actually men who were asked about perpetration reported higher levels of violence than women have reported, which really tells us something about the shame that women experience in talking about what's happened to them. And I think another very important thing that we learned from the study is that men who had perpetrated rape which of course is a minority of men, but men who had perpetrated rape had usually done so for the first time as teenage boys, including often even before the age of 15. And I think for many of us reading the study, for many people reflecting since on the study, this is one of the most important and shocking findings, because it really leads us to look at what is happening to young boys, what are young boys learning as they grow up, what kind of role modeling are they seeing that would lead them to believe that this sense of entitlement at such an early age.
រដ្ឋាភិបាលតាមរយៈក្រសួងកិច្ចការនារីក៏គាត់ធ្លាប់បានធ្វើការស្រាវជ្រាវមួយដែរយើងឃើញថា 30% នៃស្ត្រីនៅក្នុងស្រុកខ្មែរគឺគាត់ធ្លាប់ទទួលរងនៅទម្រង់ផ្សេងនៃអំពើហិង្សាក្នុងគ្រួសារក្នុងជីវិតរបស់គាត់អញ្ចឹងយើងឃើញថាអាហ្នឹងប្រហែលជាអាចតាក់ទងទៅនឹងស្ត្រីគាត់ដោយថាអត់មានវប្បធម៌មួយក្នុងការនិយាយចេញនៅពេលដែលគាត់ទទួលរងអំពើហិង្សាគាត់អត់បានបកស្រាយថាតើមានរឿងអីកើតឡើងចំពោះគាត់ហើយភាគច្រើនគឺគាត់គិតថាពេលដែលមានរឿងកើតឡើងគឺជាកំហុសរបស់គាត់គឺគាត់បន្ទោសខ្លួនឯងច្រើនជាងណា
And so we have to ask ourselves, why is this happening? It's happening because of this culture of impunity that has existed, since the Khmer Rouge period and still has not been resolved until now.
And really the key reason we can characterize as a feeling of sexual entitlement. Men carried out rape because they believed that they could. They believed that it's okay for them to take what they want in terms of sex.
ខ្ញុំគិតថាអំពើហិង្សាទៅលើស្ត្រីក្នុងបច្ចុប្បន្ននៅបន្តមានពីព្រោះថាស្រុកខ្មែរយើងអត់ទាន់មានវប្បធម៌មួយដែលធ្វើឲ្យអ្នកដែលប្រព្រឹត្តទទួលនៅទោសនៅឡើយទេហើយយើងឃើញថាស្ត្រីមិនទាន់ត្រូវបានគេពង្រឹងសិទ្ធិអំណាចគ្រប់គ្រាន់និងផ្ដល់ការគាំទ្រគ្រប់គ្រាន់ក្នុងការទាមទារសិទ្ធិរបស់ខ្លួន
Is there a link between the prevalence of sexual crimes during the Khmer Rouge period and the ongoing nature of violence against women in Cambodia today? This question is discussed by a younger generation of Cambodians.
The class is Gender and Development, and these are juniors and seniors at American University in Phnom Penh. And we've been looking at different ways that development has been constructed over time as a way of giving a theoretical framework to what's happening in Cambodia. And so right now we're beginning by looking at forced marriages and some of the remnants of what happened during the Khmer Rouge period as development questions. And one of those questions has to do with violence against women, but there's also psychological and economic and other kinds of consequences that still exist today. 40 years later, are we still talking about economic impacts? Are we still talking about domestic violence? Are we still talking about emotional impacts? What about their children? Are we talking about multi-generational impacts?
A lot of the marriage that were arranged, were forced during the Khmer Rouge, still stay till today. And half of the women in the marriage are encountering or going through the domestic violence because their husbands are exerting violence on them. But they do not want to divorce either because of the children born of the marriage bonds. And I think that really deserves our attention because it's living trauma.
There's a law that there's illegal that when there's a rape, there's an illegal activity and it can be convicted. For me, I see that it is the lack of education and the lack of enforcement of the rules of law in society that leads to the higher level of rapes in our society, rather than it is the idea that perceive it and receive it from the past. And I think for me, the education is more important and the enforcement of the law is more important. If there's an effective enforcement of law, I think the numbers of rape cases will drop down.
Those who rape can escape it with impunity because I don't know if it's a fair way to link it because during the Khmer Rouge time, rape was widely practiced that people don't think it was a problem. And that culture carry on that men do not think that raping is a problem. the victims are not well taken care of. So I think they kind of act as reinforcing each other, the culture of impunity and the legal effectiveness today. That they did like kind of case study on a man, and he doesn't even call gang rape as a crime. He just call it like leisure for the weekends. And
so talk a little bit more about that shame. What is that? Where does that come from?
The shame to herself from the society and also to her family, because rape is something that you don't want to happen. You don't want it to happen to yourself.
Thanks to the survivors who bravely testified at the ECCC and to several initiatives from NGOs and organizations, Cambodians are becoming more aware of the sexual violence that occurred under the Khmer Rouge regime from 1975 to 1979. By responding meaningfully to these crimes from the past, Cambodia is contributing to a global call to end sexual violence, whether in conflict or peace.
The fact that the tribunal has now begun to address this issue, and I pay tribute to all of the survivors in Cambodia, including those who have so bravely given evidence. I believe they are heroes to us all. There is so much stigma, and they face so much opposition. It is so important that we stand by them and protect them and hear them and respect them. It is simply, and I know all of you are here and you agree, it is simply unacceptable that crimes against women and girls happen with impunity and are still treated as a lesser crime.